All right, let's just jump right in. What if this wild surge in gold prices we're seeing, and Bitcoin kinda hitting a wall lately, what if that's not just random market noise? What if it's all part of a huge orchestrated plan for a global monetary reset? We're gonna break down a pretty wild theory that connects both these assets, the massive US national debt, and a playbook that's nearly 100 years old.
So it all kicks off with this puzzle that has a lot of smart people just scratching their heads. For years, gold and Bitcoin were basically on the same team. They both moved together as a hedge against inflation and uncertainty. But then, all of a sudden, this massive, undeniable split. The big question is, why now? And what on earth could it be signaling for the entire financial system?
I mean, you just have to look at the chart. On one side, you've got gold, the old-school, timeless store of value, absolutely screaming to new all-time highs. And then on the other side, you've got Bitcoin, the new digital kid on the block, basically stalling out after a pretty big correction. This gap between them, it's getting wider, and it's right at the heart of the theory we're digging into.
So you've got to ask, what's the motive here? Why would anyone want to orchestrate something like this? Well, according to the sources, the motive is the biggest, scariest monster in the entire global economy, the US national debt. We are talking about $37 trillion. A number so big, it's way past the point where normal stuff like raising taxes or cutting spending can even make a dent.
See, when you're that deep in a hole, you stop looking for normal solutions. You start looking for creative ones. And the theory we're looking at today claims that the creative solution isn't new at all. It's actually a rerun of a script, a playbook, written all the way back in 1933. And this is where things get really interesting. The core of this whole playbook is a classic financial move called devaluation. Now, I know it sounds totally nuts, right? Why would a government want to make its own money worth less? Well, think about it. If all your debts are priced in dollars and you can suddenly make each of those dollars worth less, then poof, your debt just got a whole lot easier to pay back. You're basically repaying what you owe with cheaper money. And that's exactly how they did it back in 1933. It was a pretty simple three-step plan. First, the government forced citizens to sell their gold to them at a really low, fixed price. We're talking around 20 bucks an ounce. Then, once the government had scooped up all that gold, they just turned around and declared, hey, you know what? This gold is now worth $35 an ounce. And just like that, step 3, the dollar's value tanked, and a huge chunk of the national debt was essentially vaporized. But what's really crucial here isn't just what they did, but how they did it. This wasn't chaos, it was surgical. It was done with very precise, legalistic language. The order back then specifically called gold a strategic asset and gave the Treasury the authority to acquire it. And the theory goes that those exact phrases could be dusted off and used again for a new kind of asset.
Okay, so that's the history lesson. That's the blueprint. But how does a 90-year-old plan have anything to do with the markets right now? Well, the theory suggests that what we're seeing with gold isn't the main event. It's just the opening act.
So, what's the magic number for gold this time around? According to the analysts behind this theory, it's somewhere around $16,000 an ounce. Now, I know, that sounds completely insane, but it's not a number they just pulled out of a hat. A price that high would give the US enough value in its gold reserves to back about 75% of its entire monetary base. In one move, it would put a solid gold foundation back under the US dollar.
And if 16 grand an ounce still sounds like pure science fiction, this table really puts it all into perspective. Just look at these numbers. Back in 1980, during the last big dollar crisis, the US had enough gold to cover 135% of all its foreign-held debt. Today, that number has collapsed to just 11%. So a huge price jump for gold wouldn't be some new, crazy bubble. It would just get us back to the historical average of around 40%. It's about restoring balance, not creating chaos.
And this is a brilliant way to think about it. This isn't necessarily about gold versus Bitcoin. As macro analyst Luke Groman says, they're both just lifeboats. They're built differently, for sure, but they serve the same purpose, to get you through a massive financial storm. This suggests a future where both assets could play a huge complementary role.
Okay, so if revaluing gold is part one of the plan, that leaves a giant question mark hanging in the air. Where does Bitcoin, the decentralized upstart, fit into this whole grand strategy?
Well, the theory suggests that any government move to embrace Bitcoin would be a classic Trojan horse. The public story, the one they'd sell us, would be all positive stuff, pro-innovation, American leadership, super bullish for crypto, right? But the alleged goal, the real goal, would be the total opposite. A path to control and ultimately confiscation, using that exact same 1933 playbook. And this wouldn't happen overnight. Oh no. The sources lay it out as a slow, deliberate strategy, playing out over several years. It would start with some kind of feel-good executive order to get the framework in place. Then, the government would just quietly start stacking Bitcoin. The trigger? The next big financial crisis. That would give them the perfect excuse for emergency action, forcing everyone to sell at a low fixed price right before a massive revaluation once all the Bitcoin is safely in their hands.
A plan this big, this audacious, it would need some incredibly powerful people to pull it off. So the next logical question is, who, according to these sources, is actually pulling the strings behind the curtain?
The term that gets used in the source material is the financial industrial complex. It's basically a theory about this tight-knit network of the most powerful players. Think massive banks like JP Morgan, huge asset managers, giant corporations, and key government agencies, all working together, shaping markets and policy for their own benefit.
And this network doesn't operate in the shadows with secret handshakes. It uses a set of powerful, public tools that the source calls the proof of weapons network. These are things like money printing through the Fed, weaponizing index funds to control what companies do, shaping the public story through the media, and of course, using debt to create leverage and force people to comply.
And this is a perfect illustration of how that control might work in practice, using the real-world example of MicroStrategy. So a company takes on a ton of debt to buy Bitcoin. Then the network dangles a carrot. Hey, maybe we'll add you to the S&P 500, which would mean a flood of new money. But then comes the stick. A public warning shot from a bank like JP Morgan, and the subtle threat of getting delisted from key indexes. It's a textbook case of how a public company can be brought to heel.
So let's bring it all together. If all these pieces, the debt, the old playbook, the market moves, the control network, if they're all connected, what's the ultimate goal? What's the end game here?
The sources are pretty clear on this. The end game is a massive, intentional transfer of wealth. And this really lays out the stakes. The winners? Well, the government, for one. Its debt problem is solved. Any insiders who knew the plan and front-ran it would do incredibly well. And ironically, anyone who opted out of the system by holding their own assets in self-custody. And the losers? Savers, bondholders, retirees, basically the middle class, the very people who played by the rules their whole lives.
And ultimately, what this theory suggests is that everything boils down to a single choice for every single one of us. Do you participate in the centralized system and trust it'll be fair? Or do you take personal control of your assets through self-custody, effectively telling them you're not playing their game?
And that leaves us with the final, massive question. Is all this just the chaotic, unpredictable noise of an old system breaking down? Or are we actually watching a historical pattern, a carefully laid out plan repeating itself for the digital age? One thing is for sure, the answer to that question is going to define the future of money and the balance of power for decades to come.